What if I told you that the men who became president of the United States won their elections through means far stranger than anything in your history textbook? That secret deals were struck in smoke-filled rooms to hand over the presidency? That a candidate once ran his entire campaign from beyond the grave? That an election was decided not by voters, but by a coin toss in a quiet county courtroom? You probably think this sounds like the plot of a forgotten novel, something too strange to be real. But here's the calming truth. Every story you're about to hear tonight is documented, recorded in old newspapers, congressional records, and the quiet footnotes of history that most people simply never read. So settle in. Dim the lights. Let your shoulders relax. Tonight isn't about outrage or alarm, it's about wonder. The quiet, curious kind of wonder you feel when you learn that the past was far stranger and far more human than we were ever taught in school. Before we drift into these stories, if you're enjoying this kind of gentle deep dive into the hidden corners of American history, consider subscribing. It helps these forgotten stories find their way to more curious minds like yours, and it costs you nothing but a click. Now, get comfortable. Let your eyes close if they'd like. You don't need to remember every detail. Just let the stories wash over you, one by one, like pages turning in an old book nobody's opened in years. We'll wander through elections filled with secret bargains, strange coincidences, forgotten scandals, and the odd human mistakes that shaped the highest office in the land. We begin in 1824, with an election so contested, so tangled, that historians still argue about what really happened behind closed doors. Some called it a deal, others called it a betrayal. History simply calls it the corrupt bargain. Let's start at the very beginning of electoral chaos, back in 1800. The election of 1800 pitted Thomas Jefferson against his own running mate, Aaron Burr. Under the rules at the time, electors didn't vote separately for president and vice president. They just voted for two names, and whoever got the most became president. Jefferson and Burr ended up tied with 73 electoral votes each. Neither man had technically won. The decision fell to the House of Representatives, where days of exhausting, candlelit voting stretched into weeks. It took 36 ballots before Jefferson was finally chosen. Burr became vice president, a decision that historians say quietly poisoned their relationship for the rest of their lives. That tangled mess couldn't be allowed to happen again, so lawmakers responded with the 12th Amendment. Ratified in 1804, it changed the rules so that electors cast separate ballots for president and for vice president. It sounds like a small technical fix, but it fundamentally reshaped how running mates were chosen and how tickets were built. Without it, we might have seen presidents and vice presidents from rival campaigns forced to share power and office for 4 uncomfortable years. It was a quiet fix to a very loud problem, one most people today have never even heard of. To understand why any of this tangled voting existed at all, we have to look at the Electoral College itself. When the framers gathered to design the presidency, they were torn. Some wanted Congress to simply pick the president. Others wanted a direct popular vote. Neither idea satisfied everyone in the room. So they compromised, creating a group of electors chosen by the states to make the final decision. It was meant to balance power between large and small states, and to add a layer of deliberation between voters and the presidency. Whether it succeeded is still debated quietly in classrooms today. Which brings us back to 1824, and the theory some call the corrupt bargain. When no candidate won a majority of electoral votes, the decision again went to the House. Henry Clay, one of the candidates, is believed to have thrown his support behind John Quincy Adams. Shortly after, Adams named Clay his Secretary of State. Was it a genuine alliance or a quiet trade for power? Historians still can't say for certain, and it remains one of early America's most intriguing unanswered questions. What makes that election even more curious is who lost. Andrew Jackson had won more popular votes and more electoral votes than any other candidate that year, yet he still didn't become president. Under the rules, the House was free to choose otherwise, and it did. Jackson reportedly seethed over the outcome for years, calling it theft dressed up as democracy. He'd get his revenge 4 years later, winning decisively in 1828. But 1824 remains a gentle reminder that in America, the most votes doesn't always mean the presidency. Decades later, In 1876, a strikingly similar puzzle emerged between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote, but disputed results in several states left the outcome unclear. Behind closed doors, a quiet arrangement was reached. Hayes would become president, and in exchange, federal troops would withdraw from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. It became known as the Compromise of 1877, a deal that reshaped the nation's direction for generations, decided not by voters, but by negotiation in a hushed room far from public eyes. Speaking of elections decided far from the ballot box, let's fast forward to the year 2000 and the razor-thin contest between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Florida became the center of the political universe as votes were counted, recounted, and counted again. Ballots were scrutinized under bright lights, hanging chads became a national vocabulary word, and the margin between the two candidates shrank to just a few hundred votes. Eventually, the Supreme Court stepped in, ruling 5-4 in Bush versus Gore to halt the recount altogether. Bush was awarded Florida's electoral votes, and with them the presidency, despite Gore winning the nationwide popular vote by more than 500,000 ballots. It remains one of the closest, most legally complicated elections in American history, a moment when 9 justices, rather than millions of voters, effectively settled the outcome. Some say the court restored order to a chaotic process. Others say it stopped a count before it could finish. Either way, the decision reshaped how Americans think about recounts, courts, and the fragile machinery behind every presidential election. It's a quiet reminder that even in modern times, with cameras and lawyers and satellite news coverage, the presidency can still come down to a handful of contested ballots in a single state, decided not on election night, but weeks later in a courtroom far from any voting booth. And speaking of moments when the system itself seemed to bend, let's talk about faithless electors, a quiet quirk of the Electoral College that most voters never think about. When Americans cast their ballots, they aren't technically voting for a candidate directly. They're voting for a slate of electors who have pledged to support that candidate. Most of the time, this is a formality, a rubber stamp on the will of the voters. But every so often, an elector breaks that pledge and votes for someone else entirely. It's happened more than once throughout history, sometimes as a quiet protest, sometimes simply out of personal conviction. In 2016, 7 electors broke from their pledged candidates, the most in over a century. Some states have laws punishing faithless electors with fines, while others have no rules at all. The Supreme Court eventually ruled that states can require electors to honor their pledge, but the tradition of an elector quietly voting their own conscience still lingers in the background of every election. So far, no faithless elector has ever changed the outcome of a presidential race, but the possibility remains. Tucked away in the fine print of a system built centuries ago, a small reminder that the Electoral College still runs on trust as much as law. And speaking of quiet exceptions built into the electoral system, Maine and Nebraska handle their votes differently than every other state in the country. In most of America, the rule is simple. Whoever wins the popular vote in a state takes all of that state's electoral votes. Maine and Nebraska decided long ago to do things differently. Instead of awarding all their electoral votes to a single winner, they split them according to results in each congressional district, with 2 additional votes going to whoever wins the statewide total. It's a subtle difference, but it means a single state can send electoral votes to 2 different candidates in the same election. This has actually happened in recent history, with both Nebraska and Maine splitting their votes between the major parties. Supporters say the system allows for a more accurate reflection of a divided electorate. Critics argue it creates confusion and unpredictability into an already complicated process. Either way, if you're ever wondering why the electoral map sometimes shows a strange sliver of a different color inside one of these 2 states, now you know. It's not a printing error, it's simply Maine and Nebraska quietly doing elections their own way, a small crack in the otherwise uniform winner-take-all tradition that governs the rest of the country. And speaking of election nights that didn't go as expected, let's revisit one of the most famous newspaper blunders in American history. In 1948, incumbent President Harry Truman was running against Republican challenger Thomas Dewey, and nearly every poll and pundit predicted a comfortable Dewey victory. The Chicago Tribune was so confident in this outcome that they printed their early edition with the now legendary headline, "Dewey defeats Truman," before all the votes had actually been counted. The problem was Truman won. When the final results came in, Truman had pulled off a stunning upset, and the newspaper's premature headline became an instant symbol of media overconfidence. A photograph of a grinning Truman holding up the incorrect newspaper became one of the most iconic images in American political history. The mistake happened partly because of early deadlines and partly because pollsters at the time hadn't yet refined their techniques for reaching a broad, accurate sample of voters. It's a gentle reminder that predictions, no matter how confident, are still just predictions. Truman's victory reshaped how pollsters approached elections moving forward, prompting new methods and a healthy dose of humility. To this day, that crumpled newspaper photograph is used in classrooms and history books, a quiet lesson about the dangers of calling an election before the voters have had their final say. And speaking of long, exhausting nights during elections, let's talk about the Democratic National Convention of 1924, a gathering so drawn out it earned its own nickname. Held in New York City, the convention became a grueling test of endurance as delegates struggled to agree on a single presidential nominee. Ballot after ballot passed without a clear winner, as regional factions, religious tensions, and deep party divisions kept the delegates locked in stalemate. Air conditioning didn't exist yet, and the summer heat inside Madison Square Garden only added to the exhaustion. As the days dragged on, delegates grew tired, tempers grew short, and the process stretched far beyond anything anyone had expected. It took an astonishing 103 ballots before John W. Davis was finally chosen as the compromise nominee, a record that still stands today. By the time the convention ended, it had lasted more than 2 weeks, one of the longest nominating processes in American political history. Davis would go on to lose the general election that November, a quiet, almost anticlimactic ending to such a dramatic and drawn-out beginning. The 1924 convention remains a fascinating reminder of just how complicated choosing a candidate can be when a party is deeply divided within itself, long before a single general election vote is ever cast. And speaking of elections with unexpected and somewhat somber endings, let's talk about William Henry Harrison, whose presidency holds a rather unfortunate distinction. After winning the election of 1840 in a campaign filled with parades, slogans, and log cabin imagery, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history, nearly 2 hours long, in cold, wet weather without a coat or hat. Shortly afterward, he developed a severe illness, believed at the time to be pneumonia. His condition worsened quickly, and just 31 days after taking office, Harrison passed away, becoming the first president in American history to die while serving. It remains the shortest presidency in the nation's history, a brief and startling coda to months of energetic campaigning and celebration. His sudden death also raised new questions about presidential succession, questions that wouldn't be fully resolved until years later with the ratification of the 25th Amendment. Harrison's brief time in office serves as a quiet, somber reminder that even the most carefully won elections can lead to outcomes no one could have predicted, a presidency that began with celebration and ended just a month later in mourning. And speaking of presidents whose careers didn't follow the usual straight path, let's talk about Grover Cleveland, a man whose political story has a rather unusual shape to it. Cleveland won the presidency in 1884, becoming the first Democrat to hold the office since before the Civil War. He ran for re-election in 1888, won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College to Benjamin Harrison, a quiet echo of the kind of split outcome that would happen again more than once in American history. Most politicians would have accepted that as the end of the story. Cleveland didn't. He ran again in 1892, and this time he won, defeating the very man who had defeated him 4 years earlier. This made Cleveland both the 22nd and the 24th President of the United States, the only person in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. It's a strange little detail that trips up trivia nights everywhere. The numbering of the presidents themselves is thrown off because of it. Historians still count Cleveland twice, once for each term, even though it's the same man both times. His return to office also makes him unique in another quiet way. He's technically both a former and a future president, depending on which term you're referencing. It's a gentle reminder that political comebacks aren't a modern invention, and that sometimes history simply likes to double back on itself before moving forward again. And speaking of elections shaped by candidates who weren't from either major party, let's talk about George Wallace's third party run in 1968. Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, ran under the banner of the American Independent Party, and his campaign became one of the most successful third party bids of the 20th century. He carried 5 southern states outright: Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi, collecting 46 electoral votes in the process. His strong regional support reflected deep divisions within the country at the time, particularly around issues of race and federal authority, themes that were reshaping American politics throughout the decade. Wallace's strategy wasn't really to win the presidency outright. Some believe his hope was to gather enough electoral votes to prevent either major candidate from reaching the necessary majority, which would have sent the decision to the House of Representatives, where he might have negotiated for influence. That scenario didn't come to pass. Richard Nixon secured enough electoral votes to win outright, but Wallace's showing remains one of the strongest third-party performances in modern American history. It's a quiet illustration of how regional loyalties and third-party movements can ripple through a national election, even without capturing the presidency itself, shaping conversations and outcomes long after the votes are counted. And speaking of third-party campaigns that reshaped the political landscape, let's rewind further to 1912 and Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt had already served as president once from 1901 to 1909, but grew frustrated with the direction of the Republican Party under his successor, William Howard Taft. So Roosevelt decided to run again, this time under a brand new banner, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party after Roosevelt declared himself as fit as a bull moose. This created an unusual three-way race between Roosevelt, Taft, and Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. With the Republican vote split between Roosevelt and Taft, Wilson was able to win the presidency with a comfortable electoral majority, despite earning less than 42% of the popular vote. Roosevelt actually outperformed Taft, making it the only time in American history that a third-party candidate finished ahead of a major party's nominee. It's a quiet lesson in how internal party divisions can completely reshape an election's outcome, sometimes handing victory to a candidate who might not have won otherwise. Roosevelt's moose-themed campaign remains one of the most colorful and consequential third-party runs in American history, a reminder that sometimes the boldest political statements come from stepping outside the two-party structure entirely, even for a former president. And speaking of independent candidates who left a lasting mark on a presidential race, let's talk about Ross Perot's run in 1992. Perot, a Texas businessman with no prior political experience, entered the race as an independent candidate against incumbent President George H.W. Bush and Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Perot's campaign focused heavily on the federal deficit, government spending, and what he described as the need for straightforward practical leadership. He used folksy charts and plain-spoken TV appearances to explain complex economic issues in a way that resonated with many voters, frustrated with both major parties. When the votes were counted, Perot had won nearly 19% of the popular vote, an extraordinary number for a candidate without a major party behind him. It remains one of the strongest independent performances in modern presidential history. Despite this impressive showing, Perot didn't win a single electoral vote, a quiet reminder of just how difficult the Electoral College makes it for third-party or independent candidates to translate popular support into actual electoral success. Some believe his candidacy pulled votes away from Bush, while others argue his support came from voters who wouldn't have shown up at all otherwise. Either way, Perot's campaign remains a fascinating case study in how a single independent voice can capture the public's attention, even without ever coming close to the White House itself. And speaking of moments that changed how candidates present themselves to the public, let's talk about the first televised presidential debate in 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Before this, presidential campaigns had relied heavily on print media, radio addresses, and in-person rallies. Television changed all of that in a single evening. Kennedy appeared calm, tanned, and comfortable in front of the cameras. Nixon, recovering from illness and reportedly avoiding makeup, appeared pale and visibly fatigued under the harsh studio lighting. Radio listeners who only heard the debate largely felt Nixon had performed well. But television viewers came away with a very different impression, one shaped almost entirely by appearance rather than words. This quiet contrast highlighted something new and permanent in American politics: the idea that how a candidate looks and carries himself on screen could matter just as much as their policies. From that point forward, campaigns began investing heavily in image, lighting, and TV strategy. It's a gentle but significant turning point, the moment American elections stepped fully into the media age, where presence and perception began sharing the stage with substance. And speaking of candidates finding new ways to reach voters directly, let's go back a bit further to Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats beginning in 1933. Roosevelt started delivering radio broadcasts directly to the American public, speaking in a calm, conversational tone about the pressing issues of the day, from the banking crisis to the ongoing efforts of the New Deal. These chats allowed Roosevelt to bypass newspapers and political intermediaries entirely, speaking directly into American living rooms in a way no president had done before. His soothing, steady voice became a source of comfort during some of the most uncertain years in American history, the depths of the Great Depression and the anxious early years of World War II. Roosevelt delivered more than 30 of these broadcasts throughout his presidency, and they helped reshape the relationship between the American public and its leaders. It's a quiet reminder that long before TV debates and social media, radio was once the revolutionary new tool reshaping political communication, one calm voice reaching millions of households at once, offering reassurance during uncertain times. And speaking of campaigns that leaned into showmanship rather than quiet radio broadcasts, let's rewind to 1840 and William Henry Harrison's log cabin campaign. Harrison, a wealthy man from a prominent Virginia family, was rebranded by his campaign as a humble frontier hero who lived in a log cabin and drank hard cider, a folksy image that had little to do with his actual upbringing. His opponent, incumbent President Martin Van Buren, was painted as an aristocratic elitist sipping champagne in Washington. The campaign produced songs, slogans, parades, and log cabin-shaped trinkets, an entire marketing effort built around image rather than policy detail. Rallies featured giant paper-mache log cabins rolled through town squares, and supporters sang catchy tunes designed to stick in your head long after the parade passed. Historians often point to this election as the first truly modern media-driven presidential race. The moment campaigning shifted from quiet political discussion among elites toward mass public spectacle, designed to stir emotion and enthusiasm. Harrison won decisively, though his presidency would famously last only about a month before his death, a quiet irony considering how much energy went into selling his rugged frontier image. Still, the log cabin campaign left a lasting mark on how American elections would be run from that point forward, less about detailed platforms delivered to small audiences, and more about symbols, slogans, and spectacle designed to reach as many voters as possible, a formula echoed in nearly every campaign that followed. And speaking of candidates finding new ways to physically reach voters across a vast country, let's talk about whistle-stop campaigning. Long before television or radio made it possible to speak to millions at once, candidates boarded trains and traveled from town to town, stopping briefly at small stations to deliver a short speech from the rear platform of the train car. These brief stops were called whistle stops, named for the small towns where trains would only pause long enough for a quick whistle signal. Crowds would gather at the station, sometimes just a few dozen people, sometimes thousands, eager to catch a glimpse of a presidential candidate speaking just a few feet away. Harry Truman's 1948 whistle-stop tour is perhaps the most famous example, a grueling cross-country journey covering roughly 30,000 miles, with Truman delivering hundreds of short speeches along the way. Many political observers at the time doubted this old-fashioned approach could compete with the growing influence of radio, yet Truman's energetic tour is often credited as part of his surprising come-from-behind victory that year. It's a quiet reminder that in the era before mass broadcasting, elections were often won one small town at a time, through direct contact between candidates and everyday voters standing along the tracks, waving as the train slowly pulled away toward the next stop down the line. And speaking of speeches that captured the energy of an entire political movement, let's talk about William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech in 1896. Bryan, a relatively unknown Nebraska congressman, delivered this address at the Democratic National Convention, while advocating for the free coinage of silver, a policy popular among struggling farmers and laborers who felt the existing gold standard favored wealthy banking interests. His closing lines, warning that they shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, electrified the convention hall. The speech is often described as one of the most effective pieces of political oratory in American history, delivered without notes, remembered for its passionate rhythm and biblical imagery. It helped propel Bryan, then just 36 years old, to the Democratic nomination almost overnight, transforming him from a little-known figure into a national symbol of the populist movement sweeping through rural America. Though Bryan ultimately lost the general election to William McKinley, the speech remains a quiet touchstone in American political history, a reminder of how a single moment of rhetorical passion can energize an entire movement, even without securing the presidency itself. It's often studied not just as a piece of political history, but as one of the finest examples of persuasive speech in the nation's story. And speaking of expanding who actually got to participate in choosing a president, let's talk about the 1920 election, the first in which women could vote nationwide following the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This marked the culmination of decades of organizing, marches, and advocacy by suffragists who had fought tirelessly for recognition at the ballot box. Millions of women across the country cast their first presidential votes that year, a quiet but monumental shift in the shape of American democracy. Warren Harding ultimately won that election, but the more lasting story is the sheer scale of who was now permitted to participate in the process itself. It's worth remembering this expansion didn't happen instantly or evenly. Many women of color continued facing significant barriers to voting for decades afterward, a reminder that the story of expanding suffrage in America unfolded slowly and unevenly across different communities and regions. And speaking of barriers that quietly kept many Americans from the ballot box long after laws technically allowed them to vote, let's talk about poll taxes and literacy tests. For decades following the Civil War, several states implemented these measures specifically designed to restrict Black Americans from voting, despite the 15th Amendment technically guaranteeing that right. Poll taxes required voters to pay a fee simply to cast a ballot, a quiet but effective way of excluding those without financial means. Literacy tests, often administered unevenly and subjectively, required voters to interpret complex passages of text, sometimes graded in ways designed to guarantee failure regardless of actual literacy. These measures persisted well into the 20th century, effectively disenfranchising millions of voters across the South. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that these practices were formally outlawed, a significant turning point in American electoral history. It's a quiet reminder that legal rights on paper don't always translate immediately into rights in practice, sometimes taking generations of advocacy and legislation to fully close that gap. And speaking of legislation that reshaped the political map itself, let's talk about the political realignment that followed the civil rights movement of the 1960s. As civil rights legislation passed through Congress, many voters across different regions began shifting their political loyalties, a gradual transformation that reshaped the electoral landscape for decades to come. Some historians describe this as part of a broader theory, sometimes called the Southern Realignment, suggesting that regional voting patterns shifted significantly in response to changing national conversations around civil rights. It's a complex and still debated area of political history, with historians offering various interpretations of exactly how and why these shifts occurred. What's generally agreed upon is that the political map of the mid-20th century looked quite different from the one that emerged in the decades that followed, a quiet reshaping of loyalties that continues to influence how regions vote today. And speaking of shifting political loyalties that historians continue to study and debate, let's talk about the Southern strategy theory. This is the idea, discussed by many political analysts and historians, that the Republican Party gradually gained support among Southern white voters over the decades following the Civil Rights era, a shift some scholars trace to changing party platforms and campaign messaging during that period. It's important to note this remains a topic of ongoing historical debate, with different researchers offering different explanations for exactly why voting patterns changed the way they did. Some point to economic factors, others to social issues, others to simple demographic changes as populations moved and aged. What's generally accepted is that the electoral map of the mid-20th century transformed significantly by the century's end, with states that once reliably voted one way shifting toward the other over a span of several election cycles. This wasn't a sudden flip, but a slow generational drift, quietly reshaping presidential campaign strategy for both parties. Candidates began tailoring their messages differently depending on which regions they hoped to win, and the map of reliably red and blue states that we recognize today began taking its familiar shape during this long, gradual transition. It's a reminder that political geography isn't fixed. It shifts slowly over lifetimes, shaped by countless individual decisions rather than any single dramatic event. Historians will likely continue debating the exact causes for years to come, but the broad pattern of change itself remains a quiet, well-documented thread running through the second half of the 20th century. And speaking of election nights that ended earlier than some voters expected, let's talk about Ronald Reagan's landslide victory in 1980. Reagan defeated incumbent President Jimmy Carter decisively, but one detail from that night still generates quiet discussion among election researchers. Carter conceded the race earlier in the evening, while polls were technically still open in parts of the West Coast, including California. Some analysts have suggested this early concession may have influenced turnout among voters who hadn't yet cast their ballots, wondering whether the outcome already felt decided before they even reached the polling place. It's worth noting this remains a topic of discussion rather than settled fact, since isolating the exact effect of an early concession on voter turnout is notoriously difficult to measure with any precision. Still, the conversation prompted broader questions about how and when election results should be announced, especially in a country spanning multiple time zones where polls close at very different hours. In the years since, this quiet controversy has occasionally resurfaced whenever elections produce early projected outcomes, while Western polls remain open. It's a gentle reminder of how something as simple as timing and geography can shape the quiet mechanics of democracy long after the votes themselves have been cast, and how election night broadcasts, however well-intentioned, can sometimes ripple outward in ways nobody fully anticipated when the numbers first appeared on screen. And speaking of outcomes that could have taken a very different path, let's talk about the quiet possibility of an electoral tie. With 538 total electoral votes up for grabs, a tie is mathematically possible, specifically a 269 to 269 split between two candidates. Should this ever happen, the Constitution lays out a specific process. The decision would move to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation, not each individual representative, casts a single collective vote to choose the president. The Senate, meanwhile, would choose the vice president separately. This scenario has never occurred in the modern era, though it has come surprisingly close in a few tightly contested elections over the decades, close enough that election analysts occasionally map out exactly which combination of swing states could produce that precise numerical deadlock. It's a strange thought to sit with, an entire national election decided not by nationwide popular vote, but by a specific and rarely used constitutional mechanism designed for exactly this kind of rare deadlock. The framers built this process centuries ago, likely never imagining just how closely divided modern electorates might eventually become. It remains a quiet contingency plan tucked into the Constitution, rarely needed, rarely discussed, yet always technically available, waiting patiently in the background of every presidential election, just in case the numbers ever align in that precise and improbable way. And speaking of numbers that came to define entire election strategies, let's talk about the rise of battleground states. As American elections grew increasingly close in the modern era, certain states began attracting outsized attention from campaigns, largely because their voting populations were closely divided rather than reliably leaning one direction. States like Ohio and Florida became particularly famous for this reason. States where a relatively small shift in voter turnout could swing the entire outcome of a presidential race. Campaigns began pouring enormous resources into these states, running more advertisements, scheduling more rallies, and dedicating more staff time there than in states considered safely decided in advance. This gradually reshaped how presidential campaigns operated altogether, with candidates focusing less on winning the largest possible national popular vote and more on carefully targeting the specific handful of states likely to determine the Electoral College outcome. Some critics have quietly questioned whether this creates uneven attention, with voters in swing states receiving significantly more campaign visits and advertising than voters in states considered safely decided either way. Others argue this is simply a natural and reasonable response to how the electoral college system was designed to function from the beginning. Either way, the rise of the modern battleground state fundamentally changed the shape of presidential campaigning, turning a handful of closely divided states into the quiet focal point of nearly every national election strategy for decades that followed. And speaking of moments when the outcome of a nomination wasn't decided until the very last minute, let's talk about multi-ballot conventions. Long before modern primaries gave voters a direct and fairly predictable way of choosing party nominees months in advance, political parties often selected their candidates through lengthy convention processes involving multiple rounds of voting. Delegates would cast ballot after ballot, sometimes dozens of times, as party factions negotiated, shifted alliances, and gradually built consensus around a single candidate. Some conventions stretched on for many exhausting days, with delegates growing increasingly weary as ballot after ballot failed to produce a clear winner. The 1924 Democratic Convention famously required 103 ballots before finally settling on a nominee, a grueling process stretched across more than 2 sweltering weeks in New York City. These extended conventions created genuine drama and uncertainty, since nobody, including the candidates themselves, could be entirely certain who would emerge as the party's chosen nominee until the final vote was tallied. It's a striking contrast to today's process, where primary results typically make the eventual nominee clear many months before the convention even begins. This quiet shift toward predictability removed much of the suspense from modern conventions, transforming them from genuine decision-making events into largely ceremonial gatherings designed to formally confirm a choice voters had already made. And speaking of decisions once made far from any voter's direct involvement, let's talk about the phrase smoke-filled rooms. This expression became shorthand for the quiet, private negotiations that once determined party nominees before modern primary systems existed. Party bosses and influential insiders would gather, often literally in smoke-filled hotel rooms, to negotiate and settle on a candidate they believed could best unify the party and win the general election. The phrase is often traced back to the 1920 Republican Convention, where party leaders reportedly settled on Warren Harding as their nominee during exactly this kind of private late-night discussion. Ordinary voters had little direct say in these decisions, their influence limited mostly to the general election itself, rather than the nomination process that preceded it. Over subsequent decades, reforms gradually shifted power away from these private backroom negotiations and toward primary elections, giving everyday voters increasing influence over who their party's nominee would ultimately be. Still, the phrase itself lingers in political vocabulary today, occasionally resurfacing whenever a nomination process feels unusually uncertain or contested. It's a quiet linguistic reminder of how differently candidates were once chosen, through private conversations among a small handful of influential figures, rather than through the broad public voting process most Americans now consider the standard and expected way of selecting who will represent their party in the race for president. And speaking of gatherings that grew tense long before any ballots were counted, let's talk about the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The convention itself was meant to select a presidential nominee, but it became far more remembered for what happened outside the hall than what happened inside it. Thousands of protesters gathered in Chicago that August, many opposed to the ongoing war in Vietnam, and the clashes between demonstrators and police grew increasingly chaotic as the week progressed. Television cameras captured much of the unrest, broadcasting images of tear gas and confrontation into homes across the country, often interspersed with footage of the actual convention proceedings happening simultaneously just blocks away. Hubert Humphrey ultimately secured the nomination, but the surrounding turmoil left a lasting impression that many historians argue overshadowed his candidacy from the very beginning. Some analysts believe the visual chaos associated with the convention made unifying the party that year considerably more difficult, though isolating the exact electoral impact of any single event like this remains genuinely hard to measure with precision. What's generally agreed upon is that 1968 marked a turning point in how conventions were perceived by the public, no longer simply ceremonial gatherings, but events capable of shaping national perception in real time. In the years that followed, parties began reconsidering how conventions were staged and managed, aware that the cameras were always watching, and that the story unfolding outside the hall could sometimes become just as significant as the one unfolding within it. And speaking of messaging that quietly evolved to reach specific groups of voters, let's talk about the broader shifts in campaign rhetoric that took shape across the mid-20th century. As the electoral map began transforming during this period, candidates from both parties adjusted how they spoke depending on which regions and communities they were hoping to persuade. Southern white voters in particular became a focus of careful messaging, as campaigns sought language that resonated with concerns specific to that region, whether related to economic change, social transformation, or simply the pace of shifting cultural norms. Historians studying this era often point to subtle changes in tone, phrasing, and emphasis rather than any single dramatic announcement, a gradual recalibration rather than an overnight strategy shift. This evolution unfolded alongside the broader Southern strategy discussions. Researchers continue debating today, though rhetoric itself is admittedly difficult to quantify with the same precision as voting data. Speech transcripts, campaign pamphlets, and recorded remarks from the period offer glimpses into this shift, though interpreting intent behind specific phrases remains, understandably, a matter of scholarly disagreement. What seems clear is that campaigns of this era were increasingly aware of regional nuance, crafting messages tailored to specific audiences, rather than delivering one uniform national pitch. This granular, audience-specific approach to campaigning would only intensify in the decades that followed, as television, then digital media, made it easier than ever to speak differently to different rooms, sometimes within the very same afternoon. And speaking of theories proposed to explain gaps between predicted and actual outcomes, let's talk about the Bradley effect. This idea, named after a California mayoral race in the 1980s, suggests that pre-election polls may have occasionally overestimated support for certain candidates, particularly in races where a candidate's background differed from historical norms for that office. The theory proposes that some voters, when asked by pollsters, gave answers they felt were socially expected, while their private voting behavior told a somewhat different story. It's important to note that researchers remain divided on how significant this effect actually is, and whether it has diminished, persisted, or simply become harder to detect as polling methods have evolved over time. Some studies have found supporting evidence in specific races, while others argue the discrepancies can be explained by more mundane factors like sampling errors or shifting turnout patterns. The theory resurfaces periodically whenever an election result deviates meaningfully from pre-election polling averages, prompting renewed discussion about whether something similar might be at play. Pollster methodology has changed considerably since the theory was first proposed, with adjustments made specifically to account for the kinds of gaps it describes. Still, the Bradley effect remains a useful, if contested, framework for thinking about the quiet difference between what people say and what people ultimately do once alone in a voting booth, a gap that statisticians continue to study with great care, if not always great certainty. And speaking of elections where the popular vote and the electoral outcome told two different stories, let's talk about the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump won the presidency by securing a majority of electoral votes, while Hillary Clinton received more individual votes nationwide, a gap of nearly 3 million ballots by the final count. This outcome reignited long-standing conversations about the structure of the Electoral College itself, a system designed centuries earlier that occasionally produces results diverging from the direct national popular vote. Supporters of the current system argue it ensures candidates must build broad, geographically diverse coalitions, rather than focusing exclusively on the most populous urban centers. Critics counter that it can, in certain elections, produce outcomes that feel disconnected from the preferences of the overall electorate. Both perspectives draw on legitimate historical reasoning, and the debate itself long predates this particular election, stretching back to the country's earliest constitutional discussions. What made 2016 notable wasn't the mere existence of this gap, since it had happened before, but the scale of national attention it received in an era of instant news coverage and constant online discussion. The result prompted renewed calls for reform in some circles, while others defended the system as functioning exactly as its original architects intended. Either way, the 2016 election added a fresh, deeply modern chapter to a conversation about representation and structure that America has been quietly having with itself since its very founding. And speaking of earlier elections that produced this very same kind of split outcome, let's talk about 1888. Benjamin Harrison won the presidency that year by securing a majority in the Electoral College, even though incumbent President Grover Cleveland received a slightly higher number of individual popular votes nationwide. The gap was narrow, but it was enough to hand the presidency to Harrison, a quiet historical parallel to elections that would occur more than a century later. At the time, this outcome sparked debate much like it would in later decades, with some questioning whether the Electoral College accurately reflected the will of the voters, and others defending it as functioning precisely as intended. Cleveland, notably, would go on to run again 4 years later, defeating Harrison and becoming the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, a curious footnote tied directly to this earlier electoral discrepancy. Historians studying 1888 often point to regional turnout patterns and the distribution of votes across specific states as the key factors behind the split result, rather than any single dramatic event. It remains a useful historical reference point whenever similar gaps appear in modern elections, a reminder that this particular quirk of the American electoral system is not a new phenomenon, but one that has quietly resurfaced across widely separated eras. And speaking of narrow margins that fueled ongoing debate for years afterward, let's talk about Ralph Nader's 2000 presidential campaign. Running as a third-party candidate, Nader received a small percentage of the national popular vote, but that modest percentage became the subject of intense discussion once the Florida results came in, decided by a margin of only a few hundred votes. Some analysts have suggested that Nader's presence on the ballot may have drawn votes away from Al Gore in that state, potentially altering the outcome of an election that was already remarkably close. Others push back on this interpretation, noting that predicting exactly how third-party voters would have cast their ballots in a hypothetical 2-candidate race is inherently speculative and difficult to prove with any real confidence. Nader himself rejected the spoiler label, arguing that voters have every right to support whichever candidate best represents their views, regardless of how narrow the eventual outcome turns out to be. This debate touches on a broader, recurring question in American elections: the role and impact of third-party candidates in races decided by exceptionally small margins. It's a conversation that resurfaces quietly every election cycle, whenever a minor party candidate earns enough votes to theoretically have influenced a close outcome, a persistent and unresolved thread running through the history of American presidential politics. And speaking of voting patterns that stayed remarkably consistent for generation after generation, let's talk about the Solid South. For roughly a century following the Civil War, Southern states voted overwhelmingly for the same political party in presidential election after presidential election, creating one of the most predictable regional patterns in American political history. This consistency wasn't accidental. It grew out of the specific political and social conditions of the post-war South, conditions that shaped party loyalty across multiple generations of voters. Historians studying this era often note that regional identity and historical memory played just as large a role as any specific policy position, with party affiliation becoming almost inherited, passed down within families and communities as a kind of cultural inheritance rather than a fresh decision made each election cycle. The pattern held remarkably steady through numerous national elections, even as the parties themselves gradually shifted and evolved on other issues over the decades. Eventually, starting in the mid-20th century, this long-standing regional pattern began to shift, slowly and unevenly, as new political alignments took shape across the country. Political scientists continue to study exactly how and why this transformation occurred, and the pace of change varied considerably from state to state. What remains clear is that the Solid South stands as one of the clearest examples in American history of just how durable regional voting habits can become, once they take root, and how gradually those habits can eventually give way to something new when circumstances finally shift beneath them. And speaking of long-standing patterns occasionally interrupted by a single unexpected vote, let's talk about the first faithless elector to support a third-party candidate. In 1972, an elector from Virginia who had been pledged to vote for the Republican ticket instead cast his vote for Libertarian candidate John Hospers. This was a quiet but historically significant moment, marking the first time a faithless elector broke ranks specifically to support a Libertarian candidate, rather than simply switching allegiance between the two major parties. The elector's choice didn't change the outcome of the election, since the margin was nowhere close, but it did highlight something important about the Electoral College system itself: the fact that electors are technically free agents in most states, capable of voting however their conscience dictates regardless of the pledge they made to voters back home. This particular case became a small but frequently cited reference point in later discussions about elector independence, cropping up whenever conversations turned toward the reliability or unreliability of the pledged vote. Some states have since passed laws attempting to bind electors more tightly to their pledged candidate, while others still allowed this kind of independent choice to remain technically possible. It's a quiet reminder that the mechanics of American presidential elections contain small pockets of individual discretion, tucked away inside a system that otherwise appears, on the surface, to run with straightforward, predictable precision. And speaking of years when elector independence appeared on a noticeably larger scale, let's talk about the 2016 election. That year saw 7 faithless electors defect from their pledged candidates, the highest number recorded in over a century of American presidential elections. These defections came from electors originally pledged to both major party candidates, reflecting a broader, if still relatively small, current of individual conscience operating within the Electoral College that year. Some electors cast votes for alternative candidates entirely, while others simply declined to support the person their state's voters had chosen, prompting renewed public conversation about whether electors should retain this kind of discretion at all. The defections didn't change the overall outcome, since the numbers involved were far too small to shift the final result, but they did reignite long-running debates about faithless electors in the laws, or absence of laws, governing their behavior in various states. In the years that followed, several states moved to strengthen or clarify their elector-binding laws, partly in response to this unusually active year. The Supreme Court eventually weighed in as well, addressing whether states could legally enforce these pledges. It remains a quiet but persistent thread in American election history, a reminder that even in an electoral system built on formal pledges, there is occasionally room for the individual elector to simply do something else entirely. And speaking of elections where the presidency and vice presidency followed 2 very different paths to victory, let's talk about 1836. That year, Martin Van Buren won the presidency comfortably, but his running mate, Richard Mentor Johnson, failed to secure the majority of electoral votes required to become vice president outright. This unusual split occurred partly because a group of electors from Virginia declined to support Johnson, reportedly due to personal objections some held toward him, leaving him just short of the threshold needed for a clear victory. It's a curious footnote in American electoral history, a reminder that the presidency and vice presidency, while elected together on the same ticket in the public imagination, are technically decided through separate electoral counts that don't always align neatly. Van Buren took office without any controversy surrounding his own election, but the vice presidential outcome required an entirely separate resolution, one that hadn't been needed since the earliest, more chaotic days of the American electoral system. This split result set the stage for a genuinely unusual moment in American governance, one where the country's normal method for choosing a vice president simply wasn't enough to finish the job, leaving the matter to be settled through an entirely different constitutional process altogether. And speaking of that entirely different process, let's talk about what happened next. In 1837, with no vice presidential candidate having secured a majority, the decision moved to the United States Senate, as outlined by the 12th Amendment for exactly this kind of scenario. This remains the only time in American history that the Senate has been called upon to elect a vice president, making it a genuinely unique moment within the broader story of presidential elections. Senators deliberated and ultimately confirmed Richard Mentor Johnson, allowing him to take office alongside President Van Buren, despite the unusual path that led him there. The process unfolded smoothly enough procedurally, but it highlighted a rarely used corner of the Constitution, one designed specifically for split or inconclusive outcomes that the framers anticipated might occasionally occur. It's a quiet historical curiosity, largely forgotten by most, yet it demonstrates just how carefully the constitutional framework accounted for outcomes beyond simple, clean majorities. Nearly 2 centuries later, it remains the sole instance of its kind, a small procedural detour taken exactly once in the long, otherwise fairly consistent history of how American vice presidents have been chosen. And speaking of elections decided through similarly unusual constitutional detours, let's talk about the election of 1800 and the remarkable closeness of Aaron Burr's brush with the presidency itself. Under the electoral rules in place at the time, electors did not separately designate their choice for president and vice president, meaning Thomas Jefferson and his running mate Aaron Burr ended up tied with the exact same number of electoral votes. This unexpected tie sent the decision to the House of Representatives, where it took dozens of ballots and considerable political maneuvering before Jefferson was finally confirmed as president. Burr, for his part, never publicly campaigned against Jefferson during the standoff, though the ambiguity of the situation left plenty of room for speculation about his intentions at the time. Some historians have suggested Burr could have actively pursued the presidency for himself during the deadlock, though whether he seriously considered doing so remains a matter of ongoing historical debate rather than settled fact. The episode ultimately led directly to the 12th Amendment, which separated the presidential and vice presidential votes to prevent this exact kind of tie from ever happening again. It stands as one of the closest, strangest brushes with the presidency in American history, decided not by voters, but by weeks of careful, exhausting negotiation inside a crowded, candlelit House chamber. And speaking of contested outcomes that left political rivals arguing for years afterward, let's talk about Henry Clay's role in the election of 1824. That year, 4 candidates split the electoral vote so thoroughly that no one reached a majority, sending the decision once again to the House of Representatives. Henry Clay, who had finished 4th and was therefore eliminated from consideration, held enormous influence over which of the remaining candidates the House might choose. Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, and Adams won the presidency shortly afterward. When Adams later appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, supporters of the 4th candidate, Andrew Jackson, cried foul, suggesting the two men had struck a private arrangement in exchange for Clay's support. This theory became known as the corrupt bargain, though no direct evidence ever confirmed that any formal deal took place. Jackson, who had won the most popular votes and electoral votes without securing a majority, felt cheated by the outcome and carried that resentment into his next campaign 4 years later. The idea of the corrupt bargain remains a theory rather than a proven fact, but it shaped American political rhetoric for decades, becoming a rallying cry for Jackson's supporters and a lasting stain on Adams' single term in office. It's a quiet reminder that even without clear evidence, a compelling story about backroom dealing can shape the course of history almost as powerfully as the truth itself. And speaking of Congress eventually trying to prevent history from repeating itself, let's talk about the Electoral Count Act of 1887. This law emerged directly from the lingering chaos of the disputed 1876 election, when competing electoral returns from several states left the country without a clear winner for months. Lawmakers wanted to ensure that no future election would descend into that same kind of prolonged uncertainty, so they crafted detailed procedures for how Congress should count electoral votes and resolve disputes when they arose. The act established rules about deadlines, state certifications, and how objections to electoral votes should be handled on the floor of Congress. For over a century, the law functioned quietly in the background, rarely tested, rarely even noticed by most Americans going about their lives. It wasn't written in the clearest possible language, something legal scholars pointed out repeatedly over the decades, but it mostly did its job without controversy. That changed somewhat in more recent elections, when ambiguities in the original text became the subject of renewed scrutiny and debate. Eventually, Congress revisited the law and passed updates intended to clarify its procedures further. It's a fitting example of how a single chaotic election can produce quiet legislative ripples that last for generations, sitting mostly unnoticed until the next moment of uncertainty brings it back into the spotlight once again. And speaking of elections defined by circumstances no one could have fully anticipated, let's talk about the record levels of mail-in voting seen during the 2020 presidential election. With the COVID-19 pandemic spreading rapidly across the country, many states expanded access to mail-in ballots, allowing voters to cast their choices safely from home rather than gathering in crowded polling places. The result was a dramatic surge in mail-in voting, unlike anything the country had experienced in modern history. Millions of Americans who might otherwise have voted in person chose instead to fill out their ballots at kitchen tables and mail them in weeks ahead of Election Day. This shift required election officials across the country to adapt quickly, processing far more mail-in ballots than usual, often under new rules passed specifically to accommodate the unusual circumstances. The increased reliance on mail-in voting became a significant part of public conversation throughout the campaign, with different perspectives emerging about its security and reliability. Processing all those ballots also took considerably longer in many states, contributing to a slower vote count than Americans were typically used to seeing on election night. It's a reminder that presidential elections don't happen in a vacuum, separate from the broader world. Sometimes a global health crisis reaches all the way into the voting booth, or rather keeps millions of people quietly out of it, changing how an entire nation chooses its leader almost overnight. And speaking of the voting map itself quietly transforming over time, let's talk about how population shifts have reshaped which states hold the most electoral power. The number of electoral votes each state receives is tied directly to its representation in Congress, which in turn depends on population counted through the census every 10 years. As people have moved across the country, away from some regions and toward others, the balance of electoral power has shifted right along with them. States that once commanded enormous influence in presidential elections have gradually lost electoral votes, while other states growing rapidly have gained significant new influence. This slow reshuffling happens quietly, one census at a time, rarely making dramatic headlines in the moment, yet accumulating into substantial changes over the span of decades. Campaign strategies have shifted accordingly, with candidates increasingly focusing their attention on states that hold growing electoral significance, while paying somewhat less attention to states whose influence has diminished over time. It's easy to assume the electoral map is a fixed, unchanging thing, etched permanently into the country's political geography, but it's actually closer to a living, breathing reflection of where Americans choose to live and raise their families. Every 10 years, the map quietly redraws itself just a little, and with it, so too does the strategic path any future candidate must walk to reach the presidency. And speaking of quiet reforms that gradually reshaped how candidates were chosen in the first place, let's talk about the primary election reforms of the progressive era. In the early 1900s, reformers grew increasingly frustrated with a nominating process dominated almost entirely by party insiders, meeting privately to select candidates with little input from ordinary voters. In response, several states began experimenting with a new idea, letting everyday citizens vote directly in primary elections to help choose their party's nominee. Florida held the first presidential primary in 1901, and other states gradually followed with their own versions over the next several years. These early primaries didn't immediately transform the nominating process everywhere, and for decades they existed alongside the older system of party conventions and insider deal-making. Still, the introduction of primaries planted an important seed, the idea that voters themselves, rather than a small circle of party officials, might eventually hold real influence over who appeared on the ballot in November. It would take many more decades before primaries became the dominant method for selecting presidential nominees across the entire country. But the earliest progressive era reforms quietly set that long transformation into motion, changing the trajectory of American democracy one experimental state law at a time, long before anyone fully understood just how much power those early primaries would eventually hand back to ordinary voters. And speaking of power that used to rest quietly in the hands of a select few, let's talk about the era of party bosses and their considerable control over presidential nominations. For much of the early 20th century, despite the gradual rise of primaries, party insiders and influential local leaders still held enormous sway over who ultimately became their party's nominee. These figures, often called party bosses, controlled delegate selection, brokered private agreements, and negotiated behind closed doors at national conventions, sometimes selecting nominees that few ordinary voters had even considered strong contenders beforehand. Candidates needed the support of these bosses far more than they needed broad public popularity, since convention delegates, not primary voters, still held most of the real decision-making power. This system produced some genuinely surprising nominees over the years, candidates who emerged from convention floor negotiations rather than from any groundswell of grassroots support. It wasn't until the aftermath of the turbulent 1968 Democratic Convention that serious momentum finally built toward reforming the system more thoroughly, shifting decisive power away from party insiders and toward primary voters across the country. By the 1970s and 80s, primaries had become the dominant, almost universally accepted method for choosing nominees. It's a quiet reminder that the democratic process Americans take for granted today, voters directly shaping who appears on their ballot, is actually a relatively recent development, arriving only after decades of quiet, negotiated control by a comparatively small handful of party insiders. And speaking of that long, quiet march toward voter-driven primaries, let's talk about 1968 itself, one of the last elections where state conventions still held enormous sway over who actually became a party's nominee. Even as primaries had existed for decades by that point, many delegates arriving at the national conventions were still selected through caucuses and state party gatherings rather than direct public votes. This meant a candidate could perform well in the primaries that did exist and still find the nomination decided largely by insiders meeting in convention halls, weighing factors that had little to do with how ordinary voters had cast their ballots. The 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago became a particularly vivid example of this tension, with chaos both inside and outside the hall reflecting a growing sense that the nominating process no longer matched the expectations of an increasingly engaged electorate. Millions of Americans watched coverage of the turmoil and came away questioning whether the system truly reflected their voices at all. That unease didn't fade quietly. It became the spark for a serious re-examination of how presidential nominees should be chosen going forward. Party leaders on multiple sides recognized that public trust in the process itself was wavering, and few wanted to preside over another convention defined by discord rather than clear democratic choice. It's a fitting note to end that era on, a final large-scale example of convention-driven nominating power, right before the entire system began shifting decisively toward the primaries, so familiar to voters today. And speaking of that shift finally taking clear shape, let's talk about the McGovern-Fraser reforms that followed shortly after. Formed in the aftermath of the 1968 convention's turbulence, a commission led by George McGovern and Donald Fraser set out to rebuild the Democratic Party's nominating process from the ground up. Their recommendations aimed to make delegate selection more transparent, more accessible, and far more directly tied to the preferences voiced by ordinary primary and caucus voters. Rather than leaving so much authority in the hands of state party leaders meeting privately, the reforms encouraged open, well-publicized contests where any interested voter could participate and see the results reflected in delegate allocations. Other states, and eventually the Republican Party as well, adopted similar approaches in the years that followed, recognizing that public expectations around transparency had permanently shifted. Within just a few election cycles, the primary calendar had grown from a modest handful of contests into the sprawling, closely watched process that defines modern presidential campaigns. Candidates could no longer rely primarily on courting party insiders behind closed doors. They needed strong organizations capable of reaching voters directly, state by state, contest by contest. It's remarkable how much of what feels permanent and obvious about today's nominating system, the debates, the early state contests, the long primary season stretching across many months, actually traces back to reforms drafted in direct response to one especially chaotic convention. Sometimes democracy's biggest structural changes arrive quietly, born from a single moment of visible discomfort that pushed leaders toward lasting reform. And speaking of states looking for greater influence within that newly reformed primary calendar, let's talk about the creation of Super Tuesday. As the primary system matured throughout the following decades, some states, particularly across the South, noticed that by the time their primaries were held, the nominating contest had often already been effectively decided by earlier states. Wanting a more meaningful voice in choosing their party's nominee, a coalition of southern states coordinated to schedule their primaries on the very same day, creating a single contest capable of awarding a substantial share of delegates all at once. This clustering of primaries became known as Super Tuesday, and it quickly reshaped how candidates approached their campaign strategies. Rather than focusing heavily on just one or two early states before moving on, candidates now needed resources and organization capable of competing across many states simultaneously, often spanning thousands of miles in a single week. Over time, other states outside the South joined this clustered approach as well, seeking similar leverage within the calendar. Super Tuesday has since become one of the most closely watched days of any presidential primary season, frequently narrowing the field of candidates dramatically in a single 24-hour period. It's a clear example of states recognizing that timing itself carries real political power and adjusting the calendar accordingly to make sure their voters' preferences arrived, while the outcome still genuinely hung in the balance. And speaking of timing carrying real political weight, let's talk about Iowa's long-standing position as the very first contest in the presidential nominating calendar. Iowa's caucuses have opened the primary season for decades, a tradition that exists largely through custom and party scheduling decisions rather than any federal law requiring it to remain first. Because Iowa votes before any other state, candidates often spend enormous amounts of time, money, and attention courting Iowa voters specifically, hoping a strong showing there will generate momentum, media coverage, and fundraising heading into the contests that follow. This outsized attention has made Iowa something of an early testing ground, where lesser-known candidates sometimes gain surprising traction, while previously favored candidates occasionally stumble in ways that reshape the entire race. Critics have long pointed out that Iowa's demographics don't necessarily reflect the broader national electorate, raising questions about whether any single state should hold such consistent influence over how the rest of the country perceives the field of candidates. Even so, the tradition has persisted through election after election, reinforced by the sheer momentum of habit as much as any formal rule. Occasionally, party leaders debate adjusting the calendar to reduce Iowa's early influence, though such changes have proven difficult to fully implement. It's a quiet example of how tradition alone, repeated cycle after cycle, can carry as much practical weight in shaping a presidential race as any officially written procedure ever could. And speaking of early contests shaping the broader national conversation, let's talk about New Hampshire's long-held position as the first primary in the nominating calendar. Following closely behind Iowa's caucuses, New Hampshire holds the first primary contest where voters cast traditional ballots rather than participating in caucus gatherings. Like Iowa, New Hampshire's early placement grants it considerable influence over media narratives, often determining which candidates are portrayed as gaining momentum and which are portrayed as struggling to maintain relevance. A strong performance in New Hampshire can breathe new life into a campaign that seemed to be fading, while a disappointing result can prompt a previously promising candidate to reconsider their path forward entirely. Candidates have long recognized this dynamic, often spending months in the state, holding small town hall meetings and diner conversations that have become something of a New Hampshire tradition in themselves. The state has guarded its first-in-the-nation primary status carefully over the years, occasionally adjusting its own election dates specifically to preserve that distinction whenever other states have threatened to move earlier. It's a small state exercising an outsized influence, not through population or electoral votes, but through the sheer power of being first and the media attention that timing reliably brings. Sometimes in presidential politics, being early matters just as much as being popular, shaping perceptions long before most of the country has even begun paying close attention. And speaking of shaping perceptions through entirely new means, let's talk about Dwight Eisenhower's use of television advertising during the 1952 campaign. As TV sets became increasingly common in American homes throughout the early 1950s, Eisenhower's campaign recognized an opportunity that no previous presidential campaign had fully explored. Working with advertising professionals, the campaign produced a series of short, simple television spots featuring Eisenhower, answering brief questions from everyday voters, an approach designed to feel approachable and direct rather than distant or overly formal. These advertisements aired repeatedly across the country, reaching households that traditional campaign methods like rallies and newspaper coverage simply couldn't access in the same way. It marked a genuine turning point in how candidates communicated with voters, shifting some emphasis away from lengthy speeches and toward brief, carefully crafted messages designed for a new visual medium. Eisenhower's opponents took note as well, recognizing that television was quickly becoming an unavoidable part of modern campaigning, rather than a passing novelty. In the years that followed, television advertising grew into an enormous component of presidential campaigns, eventually consuming a significant portion of campaign budgets altogether. It's a quiet reminder that technology itself can reshape democracy in ways few people fully anticipate at the time. One household television set at a time, until an entirely new era of political communication has arrived almost without anyone noticing the shift as it happened. And speaking of Eisenhower's television breakthrough opening the door to something even catchier, let's talk about the "I Like Ike" jingle. During the 1952 campaign, Eisenhower's team wanted something simple enough that voters would hum it without even realizing they were absorbing a political message. So they turned to songwriter Irving Berlin, who helped craft a short, upbeat tune built entirely around three cheerful words: "I like Ike." The jingle played constantly on television and radio, paired with animated visuals that made the whole thing feel more like light entertainment than a formal campaign advertisement. It worked remarkably well. The tune spread quickly, sung at rallies, hummed in households, referenced in newspapers covering the campaign's cultural reach. It became one of the earliest clear examples of a modern branding technique applied directly to presidential politics, treating a candidate almost like a product with a memorable slogan and a hook designed to stick in your head. Advertising professionals who worked on the campaign brought skills honed selling soap and cereal directly into the political arena, and it showed. The approach proved so effective that campaigns in the following decades increasingly borrowed from commercial advertising playbooks, blending jingles, slogans, and visual branding into something recognizable as modern political marketing. It's a small, cheerful moment in campaign history, but one that quietly marked a shift toward treating elections as exercises in persuasion built from the same tools used to sell everyday products on store shelves. And speaking of persuasion, taking a much darker turn a decade later, let's talk about the Daisy ad from the 1964 campaign. Airing only once during Lyndon Johnson's re-election effort against Barry Goldwater, the advertisement opened with a young girl peacefully counting daisy petals in a field. Her gentle counting was suddenly interrupted by a booming countdown, followed by the unmistakable image of a nuclear explosion filling the screen. The ad never mentioned Goldwater by name, but the implication was unmistakable. Given ongoing concerns some voters held about his statements on nuclear weapons policy. The advertisement generated immediate and intense reaction, with critics calling it fear-mongering while supporters argued it raised legitimate questions voters deserved to consider. Regardless of which view one takes, its cultural impact proved undeniable. News programs replayed it repeatedly, extending its reach far beyond the single paid airing, an early example of how controversy itself could amplify a message well beyond its original broadcast. It remains one of the most frequently studied political advertisements in American history, often cited as a defining example of emotionally charged campaign messaging. Whether one views it as manipulative or simply persuasive likely depends on personal perspective, but its influence on future campaign advertising is difficult to dispute. It's a striking reminder that a single, carefully crafted image can shape a national conversation far more powerfully than any lengthy policy speech ever could. And speaking of small, memorable symbols carrying outsized influence, let's talk about the surprisingly long history of campaign buttons. Many people assume political buttons are a relatively modern invention, something tied to 20th century campaigns and their advertising techniques. In reality, decorative items supporting candidates date all the way back to George Washington's inauguration, when supporters wore brass buttons, featuring his initials as a show of support and celebration. Throughout the 19th century, campaign tokens, ribbons, and early pin designs became increasingly common as printing and manufacturing techniques improved, allowing campaigns to produce items more cheaply and in far greater quantities. By the late 1800s, celluloid button technology had emerged, making colorful, mass-produced pins widely available for the first time, and campaigns eagerly embraced the format. These buttons served practical purposes beyond simple decoration, offering an easy way for supporters to visibly display their political preferences in public spaces, at rallies, and among neighbors and coworkers. Collectors today treasure buttons from historical campaigns, viewing them almost as physical time capsules capturing slogans, candidate portraits, and design trends from their particular era. Some rare buttons from lesser-known or unsuccessful campaigns have become especially valuable, specifically because so few were produced or preserved. It's a quiet thread running through American political history, small pieces of metal and celluloid carrying big declarations of loyalty, stretching back far earlier than most people ever realize. And speaking of everyday objects carrying political messages, let's talk about the rise of yard signs and bumper stickers throughout the 20th century. As automobile ownership expanded dramatically following the Second World War, campaigns quickly recognized an entirely new canvas for spreading their message. Bumper stickers offered an inexpensive, highly visible way for supporters to display their preferences while driving, turning ordinary commutes and errands into rolling advertisements for favored candidates. Yard signs followed a similar logic, allowing homeowners to visibly declare their political leanings to neighbors and passersby without ever needing to have a direct conversation about it. Campaigns embraced both formats enthusiastically, recognizing that repeated visual exposure, seeing a name over and over while driving through a neighborhood, could subtly reinforce familiarity and support over time. These tools were remarkably affordable compared to television advertising, making them accessible even to smaller, less well-funded campaigns running at local and state levels. Over the following decades, yard signs and bumper stickers became such a familiar part of American election seasons that entire neighborhoods sometimes transformed visually as campaign season approached, colorful signs appearing along streets and intersections almost overnight. Their simplicity is part of what made them so enduring. No batteries, no broadcast schedule, no complicated technology required. It's a gentle reminder that not every meaningful campaign innovation required cutting-edge advertising expertise. Sometimes a simple sign staked into a front lawn proved just as effective at spreading a message throughout an entire community. And speaking of campaigns finding increasingly precise ways to reach individual voters, let's talk about the rise of direct mail throughout the 1970s and 1980s. As data collection techniques improved and mailing lists became more sophisticated, campaigns realized they could tailor specific messages to specific groups of voters rather than relying solely on broad general advertising. Using information about geography, past voting behavior, and even magazine subscriptions or organizational memberships, campaigns crafted letters designed to resonate with particular concerns held by particular communities. A mailer sent to farmers might emphasize agricultural policy, while a mailer sent to suburban families might focus entirely on education or local infrastructure. This targeted approach allowed campaigns to speak somewhat differently to different audiences simultaneously, something far more difficult to achieve through a single televised advertisement reaching everyone at once. Direct mail specialists became an important part of campaign strategy during this era, treating voter outreach almost like a carefully segmented marketing exercise. Critics occasionally raised concerns about campaigns telling different audiences somewhat different things, though supporters argued it simply reflected genuine attention to varied local concerns. Either way, the practice grew steadily throughout these decades, becoming a standard tool in nearly every serious campaign's outreach strategy. It's an early example of the kind of targeted political communication that would later expand dramatically once digital tools made audience segmentation even more precise than any mailing list ever could. And speaking of digital tools eventually transforming campaign fundraising entirely, let's talk about Howard Dean's 2004 presidential campaign and its pioneering use of internet-based small donor fundraising. Rather than relying primarily on large donations from wealthy contributors, Dean's campaign built an enthusiastic online community that encouraged ordinary supporters to contribute modest amounts, sometimes just $25 or $50 at a time. Using early blogging platforms and online meetup tools, the campaign engaged supporters directly, creating a sense of grassroots participation that felt genuinely novel for its time. This approach allowed the campaign to raise remarkable sums of money through sheer volume of small contributions, rather than depending heavily on traditional fundraising dinners and wealthy donor networks. Though Dean's campaign ultimately fell short of the nomination, the fundraising model it pioneered left a lasting impression on future candidates from various political backgrounds. Subsequent campaigns studied this approach closely, recognizing that online small donor fundraising could build both financial resources and genuine grassroots enthusiasm simultaneously. Within just a few election cycles, online fundraising had become an absolutely standard component of serious presidential campaigns, with dedicated digital teams and increasingly sophisticated email and social media outreach strategies. It's a fitting example of how a single campaign, even one that didn't ultimately succeed, can still fundamentally reshape the tools and strategies future candidates rely upon for years afterward. And speaking of small donor fundraising eventually becoming a defining feature of an entire campaign, let's talk about Barack Obama's 2008 presidential run. His campaign took what Howard Dean's team had pioneered and expanded it into something far more comprehensive, blending social media outreach with an enormous small donor fundraising operation that felt revolutionary at the time. Supporters could create personal profiles, organize local meetups, and share campaign content across emerging platforms like Facebook, all while contributing modest amounts that added up to staggering totals nationwide. The campaign's digital team treated online engagement almost like a movement-building exercise, encouraging volunteers to feel personally invested rather than simply passive observers watching from a distance. Millions of small contributions, often $20 or $50 at a time, combined to outpace traditional fundraising methods that had relied heavily on wealthy donors and formal dinners. This approach also generated valuable data, allowing the campaign to understand supporter enthusiasm at a granular level rarely available to previous candidates. Analysts and journalists at the time described it as one of the most sophisticated digital operations any campaign had ever assembled, blending grassroots energy with careful technological infrastructure behind the scenes. Future campaigns from every political direction studied this model closely, recognizing that combining digital outreach with small donor fundraising could build both financial resources and a genuine sense of community among supporters. It's a quiet but significant turning point, marking the moment presidential campaigns fully embraced the internet, not just as a broadcasting tool, but as a place where ordinary supporters could feel like active participants in something larger than themselves. And speaking of digital tools continuing to reshape how campaigns reached voters, let's talk about the growing role of social media platforms by the time of the 2016 presidential election. What had once been a supplementary tool for outreach had, within less than a decade, become an absolutely central method of direct campaign communication. Candidates used platforms like Twitter to bypass traditional media entirely, sharing statements, reactions, and announcements instantly without waiting for television networks or newspapers to frame the message first. This shift allowed campaigns unprecedented control over their own messaging, though it also meant that unfiltered statements could spread rapidly, for better or worse, before anyone had time to consider them carefully. Supporters and critics alike found themselves engaging directly with candidates online, creating a level of immediacy previous campaigns simply never experienced. Analysts began studying follower counts, engagement metrics, and viral moments almost as closely as traditional polling data, treating social media presence as a genuine indicator of campaign momentum. This new landscape also introduced challenges, including the rapid spread of misinformation and the difficulty voters sometimes face separating verified information from casual online commentary. Regardless of these complications, one thing became abundantly clear. Social media had permanently altered the rhythm of presidential campaigning, compressing news cycles into hours or even minutes rather than days. It's a striking example of how quickly campaign communication tools can evolve, transforming an entire election cycle's pace within the span of just a few short years. And speaking of tools campaigns use to organize financial support, let's talk about the surprisingly structured history of political action committees, commonly known as PACs. These organizations were formally established in 1944, created initially by labor unions seeking a legal way to pool member contributions and support favored candidates without directly using union treasury funds, which federal law restricted at the time. This structure allowed everyday union members to contribute small individual amounts that, combined together, created meaningful financial support for chosen candidates. Over the following decades, this model expanded well beyond labor organizations, with businesses, trade associations, and various advocacy groups establishing their own PACs to participate in campaign financing through similarly organized channels. By the 1970s, following new campaign finance regulations, PACs had become an essential and formally recognized part of the political financing landscape, subject to specific contribution limits and reporting requirements designed to increase transparency. Candidates increasingly relied on PAC contributions alongside individual donations, creating a financing system built from many different organized interests rather than solely wealthy individual donors. Supporters of this system argued it allowed diverse groups, from teachers to small business owners, a structured way to participate collectively in political funding. Critics expressed concern that organized financial interests could gain outsized influence over policy discussions. Either way, PACs became a permanent fixture of American campaign finance, evolving steadily over the decades that followed into the many different varieties recognized today. And speaking of campaign finance rules experiencing dramatic transformation decades later, let's talk about the Citizens United Supreme Court decision handed down in 2010. This ruling addressed whether restrictions on independent political spending by corporations and unions violated First Amendment free speech protections. The court ultimately determined that such spending limits were unconstitutional, opening the door for corporations, unions, and various organizations to spend unlimited amounts on independent political advertising, provided this spending remained technically separate from direct coordination with candidate campaigns. This decision led directly to the rise of what became known as super PACs, organizations capable of raising and spending essentially unlimited funds to support or oppose candidates through advertising and public messaging. Supporters of the ruling argued it protected fundamental free speech rights, allowing organizations to express political viewpoints without excessive government restriction. Critics expressed concern that this decision would allow enormous financial resources to dominate political messaging, potentially overshadowing the voices of individual voters with more limited personal resources. Regardless of perspective, campaign spending increased dramatically in the years following this decision, with super PACs playing an increasingly visible role throughout subsequent presidential and congressional elections. Debates about this ruling's broader implications continue among legal scholars, campaign finance experts, and everyday voters alike. It remains one of the most discussed and consequential campaign finance decisions in modern American political history, fundamentally reshaping how money flows through the electoral process. And speaking of campaign committees becoming entangled in far more serious controversy, let's talk about the origins of the Watergate scandal back in 1972. The events that eventually led to President Richard Nixon's resignation began with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters located within the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. Individuals connected to Nixon's re-election committee were discovered attempting to plant listening devices and photograph internal documents, an operation that initially seemed almost bizarre in its boldness. As investigations slowly unfolded over the following 2 years, journalists and congressional committees uncovered a much broader pattern of political espionage, financial irregularities, and efforts to conceal involvement at increasingly senior levels of the campaign and administration. What began as a seemingly isolated break-in eventually revealed extensive connections to campaign finance violations and attempts to obstruct the resulting investigation. The scandal fundamentally changed public trust in presidential campaigns and directly influenced subsequent campaign finance reform efforts throughout the following decade. It remains one of the most studied political scandals in American history, frequently referenced whenever discussions arise about transparency, accountability, and the potential for campaign organizations to overstep ethical and legal boundaries. It's a sobering reminder that campaign committees, while often focused on straightforward outreach and fundraising, occasionally became entangled in far more serious and consequential controversies. And speaking of structures within presidential campaigns that developed gradually rather than through strict formal design, let's talk about the tradition of presidential and vice presidential running mates. Many people assume the Constitution specifically requires candidates to run as a paired ticket, but this practice actually developed informally over time rather than through strict constitutional mandate. Early elections initially selected the vice president as whoever received the second highest number of electoral votes, occasionally resulting in political rivals serving together in the executive branch, an arrangement that created considerable friction. Following adjustments through the 12th Amendment, political parties gradually began formally nominating paired tickets, allowing presidential candidates to select running mates viewed as complementary in terms of geography, ideology, or political experience. Over time, this practice became such a firmly established tradition that most voters simply assume it reflects a strict constitutional requirement rather than an evolved political custom. Selecting a running mate eventually became an important strategic decision, often intended to balance a ticket by appealing to different regions or voter demographics. This tradition continues shaping modern campaigns, with considerable attention paid to running mate selection as a signal of a candidate's broader political strategy and priorities. It's a gentle reminder that many familiar aspects of American presidential elections developed gradually through practice and precedent, rather than existing as strict, unchangeable rules written directly into the nation's founding documents. And speaking of running mates and formal structures that developed gradually over time, let's talk about something even more fundamental to those early elections: how electors themselves were actually chosen. Many people today assume electors have always been selected through a direct popular vote within each state, but that wasn't the case in the earliest decades of the Republic. Several state legislatures simply chose electors themselves, without any popular vote taking place at all. Lawmakers within these state capitals would meet, deliberate, and select electors they believed best represented the interests of their state, entirely bypassing individual citizens at the ballot box. This practice varied considerably from state to state, creating a patchwork system where some voters directly influenced presidential elections while others had no direct say whatsoever. Supporters of this method argued that legislators possessed better information and judgment than the general public regarding national candidates. Critics felt this undermined the democratic spirit, many believed the young nation was meant to embody. Over time, public pressure combined with democratic ideals encouraged more states to gradually shift toward popular selection of electors. By the mid-1800s, most states had transitioned to allowing citizens themselves to directly influence which electors would ultimately cast electoral college votes. It's a quiet reminder that even something as seemingly fundamental as voting for president evolved slowly, state by state, rather than arriving fully formed from the very beginning. And speaking of states that took their time adjusting to popular participation, let's talk about South Carolina's particularly lengthy attachment to legislative selection of electors. While most states had shifted toward popular voting well before the mid-1800s, South Carolina remained a notable exception for quite some time. Its state legislature continued choosing presidential electors directly, without any popular vote whatsoever, all the way until after the Civil War concluded. This meant that for decades, while citizens in other states cast ballots that directly influenced electoral college outcomes, South Carolina's electors were selected entirely through decisions made within the state legislature itself. Historians often point to this practice as reflecting the state's broader political culture during this period, one that placed considerable trust and authority within its governing elite, rather than extending that power more broadly to the general population. It wasn't until Reconstruction-era changes reshaped Southern political structures that South Carolina finally aligned with the increasingly common practice of popular selection. This shift represented more than just an administrative change. It symbolized a broader transformation taking place across the entire region during this turbulent period. South Carolina's late transition serves as a useful historical marker, illustrating just how unevenly democratic practices spread across the nation, even regarding something we might assume was standardized from the very start. And speaking of political landscapes shifting unevenly across regions over time, let's talk about how today's concept of the competitive swing state gradually took shape. For much of American history, entire regions remained reliably loyal to a single political party, creating predictable electoral outcomes that campaigns could count on year after year. Certain areas were considered safely aligned with one party for generations, making competitive campaigning within those regions almost unnecessary. Over time, however, these long-standing political alignments began to shift, influenced by changing economic conditions, demographic movement, and evolving social attitudes across different parts of the country. As reliably one-party regions gradually became more competitive, candidates found themselves needing to campaign more actively within areas once considered settled territory. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded gradually across multiple decades, as voters within these regions increasingly split their support between parties rather than voting predictably as a bloc. Campaign strategists began identifying these newly competitive areas as valuable battlegrounds, dedicating significant resources toward winning over voters whose preferences no longer felt guaranteed. This is essentially how our modern understanding of swing states emerged, not through sudden political upheaval, but through slow demographic and cultural shifts accumulating steadily over generations. Today's presidential campaigns treat these battleground regions as central strategic priorities, a direct legacy of decades spent watching once predictable political loyalties gradually soften and diversify. And speaking of long-standing traditions eventually being challenged, let's talk about Franklin Roosevelt's decision to seek an unprecedented third presidential term in 1940. Since George Washington's era, American presidents had generally followed an unwritten tradition of stepping aside after 2 terms, even though nothing in the Constitution technically required this limitation. Roosevelt's decision to break from this long-standing custom arrived during a period of considerable global uncertainty, as war spread across Europe and Asia, creating genuine concern about stability and continuity in American leadership. Supporters argued that Roosevelt's experience and steady hand were simply too valuable to set aside during such an unpredictable moment in world affairs. Critics worried that extending beyond 2 terms risked concentrating too much power within a single individual, regardless of how capable that individual might be. Roosevelt ultimately won re-election that year, and then again in 1944, becoming the only president in American history to serve 4 full terms. This unprecedented run occurred entirely within the bounds of existing law, since no formal term limit yet existed. Still, many observers felt uneasy about a tradition, informal as it was, being set aside so completely. Roosevelt's extended presidency would soon prompt lawmakers to reconsider whether such flexibility should remain permanently available to future leaders, regardless of circumstances. And speaking of lawmakers reconsidering flexibility after Roosevelt's extended presidency, let's talk about the 22nd Amendment ratified in 1951. This amendment formally established what had previously only been an informal tradition, limiting future presidents to 2 elected terms in office. Following Roosevelt's 4 election victories, many lawmakers felt it was important to codify term limits directly into the Constitution, ensuring future presidents couldn't extend their time in office indefinitely, regardless of circumstances or popularity. Debate surrounding the amendment reflected genuine philosophical disagreement about balancing experienced leadership against concerns over excessive concentration of power within a single individual over time. Supporters believed formalizing this limit protected democratic principles by guaranteeing regular turnover in executive leadership. Others worried it might unnecessarily restrict voters from choosing an experienced, popular leader during future moments of genuine national crisis. Regardless of these debates, the amendment passed and was ratified by the required number of states, permanently altering the structure of American presidential elections going forward. Every president since has operated under this clearly defined limit, unable to seek a third term regardless of popularity or circumstance. It's a fascinating example of how one individual's unprecedented political choices can directly reshape the constitutional framework governing future generations of leadership. And speaking of presidents facing enormous skepticism about their political survival, let's talk about Harry Truman's remarkable whistle-stop campaign during the 1948 presidential election. Nearly every major poll and political commentator confidently predicted Truman's defeat well before voters ever cast their ballots. Rather than accepting this narrative, Truman embarked on an extensive railway tour, traveling thousands of miles across the country, stopping in small towns and larger cities alike to speak directly with everyday voters. These brief stops, often lasting only a few minutes, allowed Truman to deliver energetic speeches directly from the rear platform of his train car, connecting personally with crowds gathered at each station along the way. His direct, plain-spoken style resonated with many voters who appreciated his willingness to travel tirelessly and speak candidly, regardless of what polling data suggested about his chances. On election night, against nearly every prediction, Truman secured a decisive victory, one of the most surprising outcomes in American political history. His whistle-stop tour became legendary, often cited as proof that direct, personal engagement with voters could outweigh confident predictions made from behind polling desks and newsroom studios far removed from everyday Americans. 73. And speaking of deeply personal matters becoming political flashpoints, let's talk about John F. Kennedy's Catholic faith and the anxiety it stirred during the 1960 campaign. At the time, the United States remained a predominantly Protestant nation, and many voters had never seriously considered supporting a Catholic candidate for the presidency. Some worried, openly and sincerely, that Kennedy's religious loyalty might somehow override his loyalty to the Constitution, that decisions in the Oval Office might answer to Rome rather than to the American people. Kennedy addressed these concerns directly, most notably in a widely discussed speech before Protestant ministers in Houston, where he insisted his faith was a private matter that would never interfere with his public duties. Many historians view this speech as a turning point, one that helped ease anxieties among undecided voters. Kennedy went on to win a narrow, closely contested election, becoming the first and, so far, only Catholic president in American history. His victory is often remembered as a quiet milestone, proof that religious barriers within American politics could shift, even gradually, even amid considerable hesitation. It remains a fascinating reminder of just how personal and how fragile voter trust can be when unfamiliar identities enter the presidential race. 74. And speaking of unfamiliar identities gradually reshaping voter trust, let's talk about how religious voting blocs themselves have shifted dramatically across different eras of American history. It's easy to assume today's religious alignments have always existed in their current form, but that simply isn't true. In earlier decades, certain Protestant denominations leaned heavily toward one political party, while Catholic and Jewish voters often clustered around another, shaped largely by immigration patterns, urban settlement, and social class, rather than theology itself. Over time, these alignments shifted considerably, influenced by changing cultural attitudes, economic conditions, and evolving positions taken by the parties themselves on social issues. Groups once considered reliably loyal to a particular party gradually found themselves reconsidering those loyalties as new generations came of age with different priorities and concerns. Political scientists often describe this as a slow realignment, unfolding across decades rather than any single dramatic election. What remains consistent is the idea that religious identity, however defined, continues shaping how many Americans approach their civic choices. Understanding this history offers a gentle reminder that voting patterns we assume are permanent today may simply reflect the particular moment we happen to be living through. 75. And speaking of religious identity shaping civic choices, let's talk about the rise of the moral majority during the early 1980s. Founded by evangelical leader Jerry Falwell, this organization sought to mobilize conservative Christian voters who had previously felt somewhat disconnected from mainstream political participation. The moral majority focused heavily on issues like school prayer, opposition to abortion, and concerns about the direction of American culture more broadly. Through church networks, radio broadcasts, and grassroots organizing, the movement encouraged millions of previously unengaged voters to register and participate in elections with newfound enthusiasm. Its influence became especially notable during the 1980 presidential election, where evangelical support helped contribute to a significant political shift within the electorate. Supporters viewed the movement as a long overdue voice for traditional values within a rapidly changing society. Critics worried it blurred important lines between religious institutions and secular political campaigns. Regardless of perspective, the moral majority's organizing techniques left a lasting imprint on how future campaigns would approach religious voters. It demonstrated how quickly a previously quiet demographic could become an organized, influential force once given clear motivation and structure to participate. 76. And speaking of previously quiet groups becoming organized political forces, let's talk about the historic role labor unions played in mobilizing voters throughout much of the 20th century. Long before modern data-driven campaign strategies existed, unions served as one of the most effective grassroots networks in American politics, particularly among working-class voters in industrial cities. Union halls became gathering places where candidates could speak directly to workers, and union leadership often provided guidance on which candidates best aligned with labor interests like fair wages, safer working conditions, and collective bargaining rights. During election season, unions organized rides to polling stations, distributed informational materials, and encouraged consistent voter turnout among members who might otherwise have stayed home. This mobilization proved especially influential throughout the mid-1900s, as unions represented a substantial share of the American workforce. Their organizing power gave working-class voters a collective voice that individual citizens rarely achieved on their own. As union membership gradually declined in later decades, this once dominant mobilization force diminished as well, changing how campaigns approach working-class communities altogether. It's a quiet but significant reminder of how organized community structures, far more than individual persuasion alone, have often shaped election outcomes throughout American history. 77. And speaking of communities whose collective voice reshaped American elections, let's talk about the gradual political realignment of Black voters between the 1930s and 1960s. In the decades immediately following the Civil War, many Black voters supported the Republican Party, largely due to its association with Emancipation and Reconstruction-era policies. This loyalty began shifting gradually during the Great Depression, as New Deal programs offered tangible economic relief that resonated deeply within Black communities facing tremendous hardship. Over subsequent decades, this shift continued, influenced by evolving party positions on civil rights and economic policy. By the 1960s, this realignment had become unmistakably clear, as landmark civil rights legislation further solidified new political loyalties that would persist for generations afterward. Historians often describe this transformation as one of the most significant electoral realignments in American history, unfolding gradually rather than through any single dramatic event. It reflects how deeply policy decisions, once enacted, can reshape voter loyalty over time. This gradual shift remains a compelling reminder that political alliances are rarely permanent, shaped instead by ongoing responses to lived experience, economic necessity, and evolving national priorities across changing eras. 78. And speaking of loyalties shaped gradually rather than instantly, let's talk about the long-standing myth that women voted as a single, unified bloc following the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. In reality, women's voting patterns varied considerably based on region, class, religion, and personal circumstance, much like their male counterparts. It wasn't until several decades later that political analysts began identifying a distinct and measurable gender gap, where women as a group started leaning noticeably differently than men on certain elections and policy issues. This gap became especially apparent starting in the 1980s, as differences emerged around social spending, healthcare, and other policy priorities. Before this period, treating women as a single predictable voting bloc oversimplified a far more complex and diverse reality. Political campaigns gradually adjusted their strategies as this gender gap became more measurable and consistent across subsequent elections. Understanding this slow emergence helps clarify why early assumptions about women's voting behavior often miss the mark entirely. It's a gentle reminder that even seemingly obvious demographic patterns often take generations to fully reveal themselves within the complicated, evolving story of American electoral behavior. 79. And speaking of demographic patterns that took generations to reveal themselves, let's talk about the modern gender gap in American voting, which became especially noticeable and measurable starting around 1980. Before this period, as we've discussed, treating women as a single predictable voting bloc oversimplified a genuinely diverse reality shaped by region, class, and circumstance. But by the early 1980s, political analysts began tracking a consistent pattern where women, as a group, leaned differently than men on a range of issues, including social spending, healthcare, and matters of war and peace. This gap didn't appear overnight. It emerged gradually, influenced by decades of shifting social roles, workforce participation, and evolving party platforms that increasingly address these differing priorities. Campaigns took notice, adjusting their messaging and outreach strategies to speak more directly to these emerging patterns among women voters. Some elections saw wider gaps than others, influenced heavily by the specific candidates and issues at play. What makes this gap particularly interesting to historians is how consistent it remained across many subsequent elections, suggesting something more structural than simply a passing trend. It stands as one of the clearer examples of how American electoral behavior can shift measurably once enough time and social change have passed, offering researchers a genuinely useful lens for understanding the decades that followed. 80. And speaking of gradual shifts that reshaped the electorate, let's talk about the 26th Amendment, ratified in 1971, which lowered the national voting age from 21 to 18. This change arrived during a period of considerable social tension, as young Americans were being drafted into military service in Vietnam, while having no formal voice in choosing the leaders who sent them there. The phrase "old enough to fight, old enough to vote" became a rallying cry, capturing a sense of fairness that resonated across much of the country regardless of political affiliation. The amendment moved through Congress and the states with remarkable speed, ratified in just over 3 months, one of the fastest ratifications in American constitutional history. It added millions of newly eligible young voters to the rolls almost overnight, prompting campaigns to reconsider how they approached outreach to younger citizens. Some worried this new group might vote unpredictably or not turn out at all, while others saw genuine enthusiasm for civic participation, especially among those personally affected by the draft. The long-term effects unfolded slowly, shaping how future elections would think about age, engagement, and representation. It remains a quiet but meaningful example of how a shared sense of fairness, once widely felt, can move remarkably quickly through the machinery of American government. 81. And speaking of newly engaged voters shaping the shape of elections, let's talk about the historically high turnout among young and minority voters recorded during the 2008 presidential election. That contest generated considerable excitement across many different communities, drawing significant numbers of first-time voters to the polls in numbers that surprised many analysts at the time. Extensive grassroots organizing, expanded outreach efforts, and widespread use of digital tools all played a role in encouraging participation among groups that had historically shown lower turnout rates in previous cycles. Community organizations, university groups, and volunteer networks worked steadily in the months leading up to the election, registering voters and providing information about polling locations and procedures. The resulting turnout figures were notable enough that researchers continued studying them for years afterward, trying to understand which specific strategies had proven most effective. Some of these approaches were later adopted in modified forms by campaigns across the political spectrum in subsequent elections. It's worth remembering that turnout patterns like these rarely happen by accident. They tend to reflect months, sometimes years, of patient organizing work happening quietly in communities long before election day itself arrives. The 2008 election offered a clear reminder that participation, once encouraged and made accessible, can shift meaningfully within a single election cycle. 82. And speaking of elections revealing unexpected patterns, let's talk gently about the occasional missteps that have occurred with early exit polling over the years. Exit polls, conducted by interviewing voters immediately after they leave polling stations, are designed to give news organizations an early sense of how an election might unfold before official results are fully counted. Most of the time, these polls perform reasonably well, offering useful early insight. But on occasion, sampling challenges, regional differences, or unexpected turnout patterns have led to projections that didn't match the final certified results. These moments have prompted broadcasters and researchers alike to reconsider methodology, adjust sampling techniques, and build in additional safeguards before making projections public. It's a reminder that predicting human behavior, even with careful methodology, involves inherent uncertainty. Statisticians have spent considerable energy refining these techniques across the decades, learning from each instance where projections needed correction. Rather than viewing these moments as failures, many researchers describe them as valuable data points, helping improve future accuracy. Exit polling remains a useful tool, even with its occasional limitations, and understanding its imperfect history offers a helpful reminder that even sophisticated statistical methods are still, ultimately, educated estimates rather than guarantees. 83. And speaking of early projections that didn't quite match reality, let's talk softly about the 1980 presidential election, when one network called the race for Ronald Reagan before polls had even closed on the West Coast. Based on early returns and exit polling from the Eastern time zones, broadcasters felt confident enough in the outcome to announce a projected winner, while millions of voters in Western states were still standing in line to cast their ballots. This raised gentle but important questions about whether early projections might influence voter turnout in areas where polls remained open, since some citizens wondered if their vote still mattered once a winner seemed determined. Election officials and researchers spent considerable time afterward studying whether turnout had genuinely been affected, with findings that varied depending on the specific study and region examined. The incident encouraged broadcasters to reconsider how and when they shared projections during future elections, particularly across multiple time zones. It's a fascinating example of how technology, in this case rapid vote tallying and analysis, can outpace the slower, more deliberate rhythms of an election still unfolding in real time. The conversation it sparked continued quietly influencing broadcasting practices for years afterward. 84. And speaking of broadcasting practices adjusting after moments of uncertainty, let's talk about how major television networks eventually came together to coordinate their election night projections through a shared exit polling consortium. Rather than each network conducting separate competing exit polls, often with varying methodologies and occasionally conflicting results, several major outlets agreed to pool resources and share a single, carefully managed polling operation. This cooperative approach aimed to improve accuracy, reduce costly duplication, and hopefully minimize the kind of premature or inconsistent projections that had occurred in earlier elections. The consortium collected data from selected precincts across the country, feeding information back to member organizations who then made their own editorial decisions about when and how to share projections with viewers. While this arrangement improved consistency in many respects, it also meant that a single technical error or miscalculation could ripple across multiple networks simultaneously, since they now relied on shared underlying data. Researchers and journalists alike continued refining this system over the years, adjusting sampling methods and incorporating new technology as it became available. It's a quiet example of institutions learning from earlier missteps, choosing collaboration over competition in pursuit of something both audiences and broadcasters valued deeply, a reasonably accurate and calm election night for everyone involved. 85. And speaking of election nights that tested everyone's patience, let's talk quietly about the confusion that unfolded on the night of the 2000 presidential election, when TV networks found themselves retracting their own projections, not once but twice in the state of Florida. Early in the evening, several networks confidently called the state for one candidate based on preliminary exit polling and early returns. As more votes came in from different counties, that call was quietly withdrawn. Later in the night, networks called the state again, this time for the other candidate, only to retract that projection as well once it became clear the margin was far too close to determine a winner through normal reporting methods. Viewers who had gone to bed believing the election was settled woke up to discover the outcome remained genuinely uncertain. The eventual resolution took weeks, involving recounts, legal challenges, and considerable public attention across the country. Researchers later studied the broadcasting decisions made that night, trying to understand how such early confidence had given way to such prolonged uncertainty. The episode became a lasting reminder that close elections deserve patience, and that even well-intentioned journalism can sometimes move faster than the votes themselves are ready to confirm. 86. And speaking of moments that encouraged more careful planning going forward, let's talk gently about how Congress standardized Election Day itself back in 1845. Before that year, individual states had considerable freedom to hold their presidential elections on different days, sometimes weeks apart, which occasionally allowed results from one state to influence turnout or voting decisions in states that hadn't yet gone to the polls. To address this, Congress passed legislation fixing a single day, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, as the official date for choosing presidential electors nationwide. This small piece of legislative housekeeping brought a surprising amount of order to what had been a somewhat scattered process. It meant that, for the first time, the entire country would be voting together, on the same day, under roughly comparable conditions. The change reflected a broader 19th century effort to bring consistency to a rapidly growing nation, one where transportation and communication were still slow enough that timing genuinely mattered. It's a quiet reminder that even something as simple as agreeing on a date required careful thought and negotiation among lawmakers representing very different regional interests, all trying to find a rhythm that could work reasonably well for the whole country. 87. And speaking of that particular choice of day, let's talk softly about why lawmakers settled on Tuesday specifically, rather than any other day of the week. In the mid-19th century, the United States remained a largely agricultural society, and lawmakers wanted to choose a day that wouldn't interfere with the rhythms of rural life. Sunday was set aside for church and rest, a day most communities treated as sacred and unavailable for travel or civic business. Wednesday was often market day in many towns, when farmers brought goods to sell and couldn't easily spare the time to travel elsewhere. Monday was considered too soon after Sunday, since many voters might have needed to travel a full day by horse or wagon just to reach their polling location. Tuesday offered a gentle compromise, allowing people to attend to their Sunday obligations, travel on Monday if needed, and still arrive in time to cast a ballot without disrupting the following market day. It was a practical decision, shaped entirely by the slower pace of rural 19th century life, and it has quietly remained in place ever since, even as the reasons behind it have faded from most people's memory. 88. And speaking of practical decisions that eventually needed rethinking, let's talk gently about the steady growth of early voting across the United States in more recent decades. What once required a strict single-day participation has gradually expanded, as more and more states began allowing citizens to cast their ballots days or even weeks before the official election day itself. This shift emerged largely from a desire to make voting more accessible, recognizing that modern schedules, work obligations, and travel commitments don't always align neatly with a single Tuesday in November. Some states developed extensive early voting periods, complete with dedicated polling locations open for weeks at a time, while others expanded mail-in and absentee options to achieve similar goals. Election officials found that spreading voting across a longer window often reduced long lines and eased pressure on polling places during the final rush. Researchers have studied how early voting affects turnout, campaign strategy, and even how candidates plan their final weeks, since a meaningful portion of the electorate may have already voted before the traditional election day even arrives. It represents a quiet but significant evolution in how Americans participate, one shaped gradually by convenience, technology, and a growing appreciation for flexibility. 89. And speaking of flexibility and how ballots get cast, let's talk quietly about the origins of absentee voting, which trace back to the difficult circumstances of the Civil War. With soldiers stationed far from home, sometimes for years at a stretch, lawmakers recognized that requiring physical presence at a polling place would effectively disenfranchise a significant portion of the male population serving in uniform. Several states began developing systems allowing soldiers to cast ballots from camp, often through specially designed procedures involving officers who helped collect and forward completed ballots back to home districts. This practice carried real political weight at the time, since soldiers represented a meaningful voting bloc whose preferences mattered greatly in a deeply divided nation. Over the following decades, absentee voting slowly expanded beyond military personnel, eventually including citizens who were traveling, ill, or otherwise unable to appear in person on Election Day. What began as a wartime necessity gradually became a permanent feature of American elections, evolving further with each subsequent conflict and each new wave of logistical challenges. It's a gentle example of how emergency measures, born from difficult circumstances, sometimes find a lasting and peaceful place in ordinary civic life, long after the original crisis has passed. 90. And speaking of quiet influences that ripple through an entire ballot, let's talk gently about what researchers often call the coattail effect. This describes the tendency for a particularly popular presidential candidate to help lift the fortunes of other candidates from the same party running for lower offices, from congressional seats to state legislatures. Voters arriving at the polls with strong enthusiasm for a presidential candidate sometimes extend that same support downward through the rest of the ballot, especially when they feel less informed about the other, less prominent races. Campaign strategists have long understood this dynamic, occasionally aligning local campaign messaging with the broader themes of the presidential ticket in hopes of benefiting from that shared momentum. The strength of this effect varies considerably from election to election, influenced by how engaged voters feel with down-ballot races and how closely those candidates are associated with the party's leading figure. Some elections show a pronounced coattail effect, while others reveal voters splitting their choices quite deliberately between different parties for different offices. Political scientists continue studying exactly how strong this influence remains in an era of increasingly individualized campaigns, offering yet another quiet thread connecting the presidency to the vast, sprawling web of American elections happening every single cycle. 91. And speaking of quiet strategic thinking that shapes a ticket long before votes are cast, let's talk gently about the tradition of balancing the ticket. Presidential candidates have long chosen running mates not simply based on personal friendship or shared ideology, but often with an eye toward broadening appeal across the country. A candidate from one region might select a vice presidential partner from another, hoping to strengthen support in areas where the top of the ticket feels less familiar to voters. Sometimes the balance is geographic, pairing a northern candidate with a southern running mate, or someone from a large industrial state with a partner from a rural or agricultural one. Other times the balance leans ideological, bringing together slightly different wings of the same party to present a broader, more unified front. This practice has shaped countless campaigns throughout American history, with strategists carefully weighing which combination might reassure the widest range of voters. It's rarely a simple decision, and the reasoning behind it isn't always visible to the public at the time. Historians looking back on these choices often find fascinating calculations hidden beneath what seemed, on the surface, like a simple partnership between two political allies working toward the same modest goal of winning in November. 92. And speaking of adjustments made to smooth out earlier confusion, let's talk softly about the election of 1804, which introduced a quiet but important change to how Americans voted for their national leaders. Under the original system, electors cast votes without distinguishing between president and vice president, which had created considerable strain in earlier elections when running mates ended up tied or oddly positioned against one another. The 12th Amendment, ratified shortly before this election, resolved that awkwardness by requiring separate ballots for each office, allowing electors to clearly indicate their choice for president and their choice for vice president individually. This may sound like a small technical adjustment, but it reshaped the entire structure of presidential campaigns going forward. Political parties could now present unified tickets with confidence, knowing their chosen pairing would be voted on as intended, rather than risking an unpredictable outcome born from an outdated procedural quirk. The change reflected a broader willingness among early lawmakers to learn from experience and refined the constitutional framework as new challenges revealed themselves. It's a gentle reminder that even foundational systems of government sometimes need thoughtful revision, not because the original framers failed, but because governing a growing nation is rarely something anyone gets perfectly right on the very first attempt. 93. And speaking of foundational moments that quietly shaped everything that followed, let's talk gently about George Washington's first inaugural address and the precedent it established for the peaceful transitions that would follow. Delivered in New York City in 1789, the speech itself was modest in tone, filled with humility rather than triumph, as Washington expressed genuine uncertainty about his own qualifications for the role he'd been asked to fill. What mattered most wasn't necessarily the content of the address, but the simple fact that it happened at all, a newly formed government transferring authority through ceremony rather than conflict. Washington's willingness to step into the presidency, and later to step away from it after 2 terms, created an enduring model for how power could change hands without bloodshed or upheaval. Future presidents looked back to that first inauguration as a kind of quiet template, one built on restraint, humility, and respect for the fragile institutions still taking shape. It's easy to overlook just how uncertain that first transition truly was, with no established customs to rely on and no guarantee the experiment would hold. Washington's calm, careful approach helped ensure it did, setting a tone that would echo through inaugurations for generations to come. 94. And speaking of quiet customs that reinforce peaceful transitions, let's talk gently about the tradition of concession speeches, a practice that has become deeply woven into American political culture despite never being required by law. When a candidate publicly acknowledges defeat, congratulates their opponent, and calls for unity, they aren't fulfilling any constitutional obligation. They're honoring an informal tradition that gradually developed over generations, reinforcing the idea that elections, however hard fought, should end with grace rather than continued conflict. These speeches often carry emotional weight, offering supporters a sense of closure while signaling to the country that the democratic process has run its course. Historians point to various moments throughout the 20th century where concession speeches helped ease national tension following particularly close or contentious elections, providing reassurance during periods that might otherwise have felt uncertain or unsettled. The tradition relies entirely on voluntary participation, a quiet gentleman's agreement passed down through decades of political custom rather than formal rule. Because it isn't mandated, its presence or absence can shape public perception in meaningful ways, revealing just how much unwritten tradition contributes to the stability of a system that, on paper, depends almost entirely on the willingness of individuals to honor expectations no law technically enforces. 95. And speaking of unwritten expectations that have held remarkably steady, let's talk quietly about the long, largely unbroken pattern of peaceful transfers of power that has defined American elections since 1797, when John Adams succeeded George Washington. Across more than 2 centuries, encompassing wars, economic collapses, and deep social upheaval, the country has generally managed to move from one administration to the next without the kind of violent disruption that has troubled many other nations throughout history. This doesn't mean every transition felt calm in the moment. Many were tense, bitterly contested, or shadowed by uncertainty. Yet time and again, the losing side ultimately stepped aside, allowing the machinery of government to continue functioning. Scholars often point to this continuity as one of the quieter achievements of American democracy, a pattern maintained not through force, but through shared expectation and institutional trust. It's a kind of steady rhythm that's easy to take for granted, precisely because it has held so consistently, election after election, decade after decade, through circumstances that might have shaken a less established system entirely apart. 96. And speaking of transitions that tested the strength of that long tradition, let's talk gently about the aftermath of the 1860 election, when Abraham Lincoln's victory set in motion a wave of secession before he'd even taken his oath of office. Several southern states, deeply unsettled by the outcome and the direction it seemed to signal for the nation's future, began formally withdrawing from the Union in the months between the election and Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861. This period remains one of the most unusual in American political history. A newly elected president watching from a distance as the country he'd been chosen to lead began quietly fracturing beneath him. By the time Lincoln finally arrived in Washington, several states had already declared their departure, leaving him to assume leadership of a nation already in the early stages of crisis. It stands as a striking reminder that peaceful transitions, while remarkably consistent throughout American history, weren't always calm beneath the surface, and that an election's outcome could set enormous forces into motion long before a single day of governing had even begun. And speaking of campaign phrases that managed to outlive the men who first spoke them, let's talk gently about the 1840 election and the slogan that became Tippecanoe in Tyler too. William Henry Harrison's campaign leaned heavily on his military reputation from the Battle of Tippecanoe decades earlier, pairing it rhythmically with the name of his running mate, John Tyler. The phrase spread through songs, banners, and rallies, becoming one of the first true examples of a modern campaign slogan designed as much for memorability as for meaning. It didn't explain policy or platform. It simply stuck in the mind, repeated at gatherings, and printed on ribbons worn by supporters. Historians often point to this campaign as a turning point in American political messaging, showing how emotion and rhythm could shape public enthusiasm just as effectively as substantive argument. Harrison won the election convincingly, though he would serve only a month before his death, making the slogan almost more enduring than the presidency it celebrated. It's a curious little footnote, a reminder that sometimes the simplest words, repeated often enough, can outlast the events that inspired them, echoing quietly through history long after the excitement of that particular autumn had faded away. And speaking of choices candidates made that might seem unusual by today's expectations, let's talk softly about the years when debates weren't considered a necessary part of running for president at all. For much of American history, direct debates between candidates were rare, sometimes viewed as beneath the dignity of the office, or simply unnecessary given how campaigns were conducted through surrogates, newspapers, and public appearances instead. Some candidates avoided debating opponents altogether, believing there was more to lose than gain by sharing a stage with a rival. It wasn't until TV entered the picture that debates became something close to an expectation rather than an option, reshaping how voters connected with candidates on a more personal, visual level. Even after that shift, some candidates in later decades still chose strategically to limit or skip debates when trailing far behind or far ahead in the polls. It's a gentle reminder that traditions we now take for granted, like the modern debate stage, developed gradually, shaped as much by strategy and technology as by any firm rule about how a democracy ought to choose its leaders. And speaking of quiet innovations that changed how we understand public opinion itself, let's talk gently about George Gallup and his remarkably accurate prediction during the 1936 election. At a time when most forecasting relied on unscientific methods, including one large magazine poll that famously predicted the wrong outcome, Gallup instead used smaller, carefully selected samples designed to reflect the broader population statistically. His method successfully predicted Franklin Roosevelt's victory, standing in stark contrast to the flawed assumptions of earlier polling attempts. This success helped establish the foundation for modern scientific polling, an approach built on probability and representative sampling rather than sheer volume of responses. It reshaped how campaigns, journalists, and eventually the public came to understand and anticipate elections long before votes were counted. Gallup's work didn't eliminate uncertainty entirely, but it introduced a level of rigor previously missing from the process, quietly transforming a rough guessing game into something closer to a measured science, one that continues shaping expectations before every election night to this day. And speaking of moments when the popular will and the formal mechanics of the Electoral College didn't quite align, let's talk quietly about the handful of elections where the candidate who won the popular vote didn't ultimately become president. This has happened 5 times across American history, each instance prompting renewed conversation about how the Electoral College functions and whether it still reflects the country's evolving expectations. These moments tend to arrive without warning, often in exceptionally close contests where narrow state margins carry outsized influence over the final outcome. Rather than signaling failure, many historians view these instances as revealing the tension built into a system designed to balance both population and state-level representation. It's a quiet recurring reminder that American elections rest on a framework crafted centuries ago, one that continues shaping outcomes in ways the founders themselves may never have fully imagined. Closing our journey through 100 quiet corners of presidential history, with one gentle, lingering question about how democracy continues to define itself, election after election, night after night.